Welcome to the fifth edition of the Setmana, Investigació. We started 1 week ago, but this is the Setmana, Investigació is this one. So Frederic is going to say a couple of words, and then we're going to start with the conference. I'm not going to repeat the program of the week. You already know, in the Venton you have the program, you can download it. So this week we continue with the different activities, and so, Frederic.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this second week of research, Setmana de la Investigació. Let me just make a short introduction in Catalan, later in English. Bon dia a tothom, benvingudes, benvinguts a la 5a setmana de la recerca del programa de doctorat en Comunicació del Departament de Comunicació de la Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Crec que és just dir que al llarg d'aquests 5 anys la Setmana de la Investigació s'ha consolidat com un dels principals esdeveniments del nostre departament. És una iniciativa que tots considerem fenomenal, que esperem que n'hi hagi una 6a, una 7a i fins allà on puguem. I tant pel que fa a l'oferta de coneixement i la possibilitat de tenir investigadores i investigadors de gran prestigi, és el cas del nostre convidat d'avui, el David Nieborg, un dels grans experts en plataformes i plataformització, o de la Leonarda García, que ens visita el divendres que ve, amb una xerrada sobre les teories de la comunicació i en qüestió o des d'una perspectiva de gènere. Però també ho és per la possibilitat de fer xarxa, de construir comunitat entre doctorants i doctorandes del departament, i que crec que és una gran oportunitat per fer d'aquesta experiència del doctorat una experiència no només individual i solitària, sinó també col·lectiva i comunitària. Espero que en tragueu molt de profit i molta sort en aquesta aventura, els que comenceu, els que esteu al mig i també els que esteu acabant amb la vostra tesi doctoral. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 5th research week of the Department of Communication at the University Pompeu Fabra. In the last 5 years, this week has become one of the most relevant research events at our department. We consider it's a fundamental initiative, not just because of the possibility to have here influential researchers, great researchers, as it is the case of David Nieborg in the field of platforms and platformizations, but also Leonarda García, who will be presenting her works on theories of communication from a gender perspective, but also because of the opportunity to create networks of knowledge to build community of PhD students in the department. I hope that you all will enjoy the week, and with good luck with this wonderful adventure that is the PhD dissertation. Thank you and welcome again.
Okay, thank you, Frederic. ¿En qué hablo? Bueno, quería agradecer sobre todo a Pilar, toda la colaboración en la organización de la Setmana de la Investigació, y Lorena, por más que ahora no está en el equipo de coordinación del doctorado, sigue estando, no solo virtualmente, porque nos ha dado también una mano con toda su experiencia, y todo el personal técnico. Esto se emite por streaming, después también será colgado, será subido a las redes y será público. Así que, muchísimas gracias a toda la gente que hace posible este evento y todas las actividades de la semana, también a los grupos de investigación del departamento. I'm going to introduce David. David Nieborg is Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Toronto and Visiting Professor at the University of Amsterdam. He held visiting and fellowship appointments with MIT in Boston, the Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. David published on the game industry, app and platform economics, and game journalism in academic outlets such as New Media and Society, Social Media and Society, Media, Culture and Society. He's the co-author of a book called Platforms and Cultural Production with Thomas Poel and Brooke Erin Duffy, published last year in Polity. And next year, you're going to publish a new book in MIT Press, Mainstreaming and Game Journalism. So, welcome, David, to Pompeu Fabra. Welcome to the Poblenou campus and to our department and our PhD program. So, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thanks, gracias, bon dia. My name is David. Thanks so much for having me, for hosting me, Professor Scolari. I really appreciate being here in this beautiful city. Yeah, let's just dive straight in. And the first thing I'll do is everything I'm going to talk about you can download. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of papers and really flesh out the work we've been doing and point to some research we've been doing. Some is about economics, some is about infrastructures. And if you follow this link, all the papers I'm going to talk about you can download there. There's a nice surprise. Don't tell the publisher, but there is something in there that shouldn't be in there. Wink, wink. So it's all there, and the slides I'm going to show right now are there as well, if you want to look at them again. So what I want to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to talk about this book in the middle. And what I would love to talk about is how we arrived at that book together with my colleagues, and also what's next for us, but that's a minute at the end. I think it's important, and I would like to use this opportunity to talk about sort of scholarly trajectories, so to say, because many of you are in phases of your career where you can make these decisions. What are you going to do next? And I remember that so well. It's not that long ago for me. So I would love to talk about what decisions we made, how we arrived at certain projects, and also how these books came together and what we've done, what fed into the book, so the research that fit into the book. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of papers. I cannot go in depth with every paper, but if you find it interesting, all the papers are in the Dropbox, in the folder, so you can always dive in if you find it interesting. Sort of the genesis or the birth of this project partially was working for me with Professor José van Dijk in University of Utrecht, Thomas Poel, and Martijn de Waal. I was not involved in this first book, you may have heard of it, but we've been working closely together. Then Thomas Poel and I worked, and Aaron Duffy worked on this book, which I'm going to talk about today, Platforms in Cultural Production. And as we speak, we're thinking and writing about this sort of third book. It's not a trilogy for me, but it feels a little bit like it with José and Thomas. The working title is Platform Power, but that's a horrendous title because everybody talks about it. So it's a bit too much to have a book with platform power. I think half of the room will be angry. It's like, okay, that's a bit too broad. So if you have any ideas for a better title, shout it at us. We're very open to, because we don't have one yet. And so the working title is Platform Power. But enough about that. Let's really talk about this book in the middle, because that's what I've been working on the most recently. This is the question that animates the book. What are the political economic implications of cultural production becoming platform dependent? Sort of a straightforward question, but the simplest questions are always the hardest to answer, right? Before I sort of dive into how we arrived at the book and some examples and some theory, I want to flesh out two concepts because we always get questions about those, and we made decisions about how to define these concepts, cultural production and platforms. And we can debate if you agree, but this is the decisions we made to sort of bracket the book and make it a bit more comprehensible to avoid those discussions and conversations. So those two terms are, of course, platforms. In the book, we focus squarely on US and China-based platform companies, which are the top ones. So for us, that's in the context of this book, that's our focus. So we don't talk about Airbnb or Uber. In the book, these are platforms focused on cultural production or squarely rooted, situated in the media industries. That doesn't mean that other platform companies are irrelevant, of course, but in the context of the book, we want to be precise about the definition and focus of our sort of case studies. So that's what we consider platforms. And the second part is what is cultural production? And I think that's also important because throughout the project, before, during, and after, it's like, hey, what is cultural production? Because we may have, each of us may have our different understanding of this. This is our understanding, again, for the purpose of the book. Cultural producers are organizations and individuals who engage in market-based forms or modes of symbolic artifact production. So these are companies, they want to make money. They're professionals. So some of you may be asking, hey, what about co-creation or producage, or are there all these sort of in-between practices? Maybe some of you yourself are aspiring to be, TikTok famous. Tell me about it during the Q&A, please. That's not really what we consider cultural production in the book, right? So it's very relevant, culturally relevant, politically relevant, etc. But in this book, we focus squarely on those who want to be professionals, who want to engage in for-profit modes of cultural production. So that's just a decision to keep the conversation manageable, otherwise it becomes a very different book. So we have a very institutional focus. We're interested in industries, less in what we call end users or citizens, not because they're less important, but that's the focus, to keep it focused. Okay, how does this project came about? I just happened to talk about it a minute ago. In 2017, at AIR, Association of Internet Research in Estonia, we got together for the first time, and I wanted to show you this and tell you about this because it's such a good example of the purpose, how relevant conferences can be. Sometimes at conferences you present something and then never happens after, but this turned out to be sort of the birth of a whole new line of research. And if we would have known at the time that it became so big, we made this paper so much better and polished it even more. I got together with Thomas Poole, Brooke Duffy from Cornell, but also Robert Prey from Groningen, he studies music, and Stuart Cunningham from Australia. So we got together to have this conversation, and this is really the start of our, literally a conversation, not a figurative conversation, but a literal conversation between Thomas Poole and me. Thomas is in Amsterdam. He focuses on journalism, and he kept talking about journalism and journalists and protest and collective action. And my background is in game studies. I study video games, PlayStations and Xbox. And in 2016, 17, 18, we were talking about the rise of platforms, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And I said, okay, in the game industry, this is how it works. And then Thomas was like, well, in journalism, this is how it works. So we went back and forth. We drove each other crazy that way. But it was a very generative, a very productive conversation because there were parallels. He said, yeah, but in journalism, this is how it works like this. I was like, well, in game industry, you always need a platform. That's what we noticed. And then we involved Robert Prey in the conversation. He says, well, in the music industry, you had Napster, then you have peer-to-peer, you had Spotify. This is how platforms are involved in the music industry, which is the same but different. And that became a theme, the same but different. And then Stuart Cunningham came along and Brooke, and they focus on creators, influencers, depending how you want to call them. I'm not going to step into that debate. And again, that's very different. Platforms have a different role, not better or worse or bigger or smaller, but very different. So that became the start of this conversation. Then we published a paper in New Media and Society, Platforms and Cultural Production. Again, if we would have known that this would be picked up more than we anticipated, we would have polished it even better. It really resonated with a lot of people because it provided a framework that became the basis of the book. And I wanted to show you this because there's a lineage. So if you're thinking about your own project, maybe you're thinking about a book or a set of papers, what worked really well for us is to start with a conference paper, then a journal article. Then we did a special issue, or 2 special issues, and some people in the room were part of the special issue. We had 26 papers. This is all open access. So if you find this interesting and you're thinking about your own research project, this is all open access material. 26 papers that each focused on a very specific aspect of platforms and cultural production. So there are papers on webtoons in Korea, booktubing in Spanish language, a lot of cool stuff, essentially. And this helped us tremendously to flesh out and to have case studies for the book, because we could have never done this amount of research. Early career scholars, senior scholars, and they really focused on different regions, on different methods, on different theories, and all of that fed into our understanding of the book. So that became this. This is the outline and the structure. What I want to talk about today mostly is the first part, because I essentially wrote the first half and Brooke wrote the second half, and Thomas was there with a whip in the background, a figurative Dutch whip, don't worry. We're fine. And he drove us to do this. So I'm going to mostly focus on the first part today, but if you want to ask any questions on labor, creativity, etc., it's there as well. So what's this book about? This is the argument. Platforms and online communication, more generally, have long been associated with a discourse of democratization of cultural production. So in the mid-2000s, co-creation, participatory culture, Henry Jenkins, you may have heard these names, Axel Bruns in Australia. So this democratization, co-creation, and that's undeniably true. Right? This is part of the argument that it's not that those scholars were wrong, which is a terrible way to have those kinds of conversations anyway. It's not about right or wrong, but at that time there was such an enthusiasm. I remember it while I was doing my PhD. I was very influenced by Henry Jenkins' Convergence Culture book. It was exciting research, like, oh, everybody has a voice now, fans can talk back. And you're probably familiar with these debates if you have had classes in media studies. So that is undeniably true, and we also don't want to throw that away. The opportunity that everybody in this room can open their phone and become TikTok famous, if that's your ambition, right? You have that opportunity. Whether you will succeed, that's of course the other part of the conversation. It remains unclear how the introduction of platforms in the media ecosystem reshapes cultural creation, distribution, and marketing and monetization. And that really is the big question. We have a sense, we have a better sense, and every month that goes by, fantastic research does come out that gives us a better sense of this, but it's still grappling because it's so complicated and complex and sort of a big question. The second part of the argument then is platformization is very much a process. It's ongoing, and it plays out in different ways in different parts of the world. It's a process that opens up new opportunities, like your TikTok, your Instagram, YouTube, to find audiences and generate revenue. And I think we have to constantly, or at least I have to say that to myself, remind myself that these are indeed new opportunities that are truly exciting and have not been there. It depends sort of on your age, that have not been there 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So it's truly exciting to find audiences and potentially generate revenue. But at the very same time, there is such an unprecedented concentration of power and money and wealth, and also political cultural power among a few platform corporations. And I will only say his name once, and then I hopefully all the rest of the day cannot say it anymore. But we all have seen the last couple of weeks what might happen. See, ooh, I can say this without saying his name. Like I'm Voldemorting. Yes, I'm gonna Voldemort him. Yeah, so we all know what I'm talking about, right? It rhymes with Smitter and Schmushk. So I'm aware that this might be live streamed. I don't want death threats in my inbox tomorrow. Everything is great on Twitter. So yeah, we can all see this. Unprecedented concentration. You can be so wealthy, you buy a platform, and then, okay, that's, okay. Oof, I promised myself not to wade into this. So, okay, this is the argument. Let me wade into the book and give you a sense of the argument. And let me start by an example that is close to home and I finding inspiring. It's also part of the book. It's opening of chapter 2. To really illustrate this argument and to give you a sense of the theories and the concepts and, again, this argument of the book. The story starts in 2007. The dude on the right, he's very much a dude, I think. Mark Pincus. On the left is his dog. His dog is named Zynga. And if you're familiar with the interwebs and video games, you know where this story might be going. Startup, entrepreneur, Silicon Valley, San Francisco. That's sort of the context of the story, 2006, 7, 8. He wanted to build a company. He was interested in video games. And at that very time, there was a platform out there for him. It was called Facebook. You may have heard of it. It was around, and he had an option. So he really liked video games, right? You can see it sort of like playing poker, playing cards, board games, etc. He was into games, and he had many options at the time. He could go to the newest PlayStation. I think at the time was the PlayStation 3 for the gamers in the room, Xbox 360, Nintendo Wii. At the time was very exciting, Nintendo Wii, you remember, with the bowling and the tennis. That was awesome. So he could go that route with his ideas and his money, but it was really hard. It was, and it still is, really hard to get in the game industry, just with a dog and money. It's not easy. But then Facebook was out there, and he was like, ooh, this might be exciting. It was run by another dude, another Mark Zuckerberg, the Zuck, as he's known. Yeah, it's not my nickname. That's how they call him, the Zuck. And I also promised myself not to make too many derogatory jokes about Mark Zuckerberg, which I find really hard. Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg, he's a person. And in 2007, he had this platform, the Facebook, and he wanted to build it out as a platform. He said a platform for new businesses. So he had this website, and you all probably know the origin story of Facebook, right? It was first for students, and then it grew and it opened up. And so it was first a social network to connect students, but he was like, hey, I want to make money, right? Silicon Valley, San Francisco, it's all about the money. So we open up the boundaries, and this is an important way of thinking about this. We open up the boundaries of the platform for new businesses. So Mark and Mark was sort of a match made in, depend where you're coming from, heaven or hell. They found each other, sort of a bromance, if you want to call it that. Mark Pincus was into poker, why not? So they launched Texas Hold'em Poker on Facebook. So you could play Texas Hold'em Poker. Maybe some of you have played this early days, which was fairly new to do that. Of course, you could play poker online, but now you could do it on Facebook. Okay, all nice, fine and dandy, 2007, great. So what happened then, this was not that special. What happened then, Facebook started growing really fast. We know probably all the origin story. More students it opened up to colleges, Americans, everybody, Canada, North America, Europe. So Facebook started growing like crazy. And what did Mark Pincus do? He had another game idea. You may have seen this as well, Farmville. Also not really original, because Texas Hold'em Poker is not made or thought of by, it was an existing idea, right? Mark Pincus, if only he would be that original, like it existed for a really long time. Farmville, the concept was also not that new, but what was very new is that he didn't go to Nintendo, he didn't go to PlayStation, because they probably wouldn't have wanted him anyway. This game is too small for the Wii, it's too small for the PlayStation, right? If you want to be on the PlayStation, you have to kill stuff, zombies or soldiers. And this is very friendly, right? You have a farm, you walk around there. It's all pretty, fun. I love, as you can see, I love talking about Farmville. Anybody played this here, Farmville? 1, 2, 3, yeah. See, you see people, okay, now I'm willing to admit I had an addiction to Farmville. And you probably knew how it worked. What was the innovation of this relationship between Mark and Mark? It was not so much the game. You attend to a farm and then it grows. It's all, very, you see what you see is what you get. The innovation was, of course, that it was fully infrastructurally integrated with the social graph, the core of what Facebook was about, which was connecting to other people. And what Mark Pincus did is that you could post on other people's wall. And if you were on Facebook at the time, you may have remembered this, because it was incredibly annoying, unless you were playing Farmville. But those people playing Farmville were like, oh, click this thing on somebody else's wall, and if you click it, you get free coins, or you get a purple tractor, or you get a duck, or you get something. And people who were not playing Farmville saw that on their walls and like, oh my, I like you as a friend, but go away. So it worked really well for Zynga, because free marketing was free PR, of course. They didn't have to pay anything to Facebook. Facebook saw a lot of engagement which was a metric for Facebook. People logged in every 30 minutes. You had to water your plants. Every hour you had to water your plants, and you like and click. So a small group of people really liked this, but Facebook didn't, because the majority of Facebook people did not play this, and they, it became this. You might know Facebook language. It got complicated. So they broke up. Mark and Mark were like, whoop, no us. So what's the point of this story? Facebook is a platform. Mark Pincus decided to integrate his game economically and infrastructurally in the fabric, the economic and infrastructural fabric of Facebook. And then all of a sudden, Mark Zuckerberg says, no, go away. They were not kicked off the platform, but they stopped that whole wall posting stuff, like none of that. And you can see there, it's pretty clear what happened after, right? The stock price of Zynga cratered, and it never really recovered. May of this year, it was bought by another publisher, Take-Two, but it took a really long time for them to get up on their feet again, because they were sort of kicked somewhere by Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, what's the moral of this story? The moral of this story is the question, what happens if cultural production, and in this case it's game production, but it can be journalism, it can be any other form of cultural production, what happens if it becomes platform dependent? And in the first half of the book, we make this distinction between a shift in markets, and the shift in markets for Facebook was all of a sudden you could have a free game on Facebook. Right? It's a new business model, which was, again, at the time, very new for the game industry. Before that, you had to pay 50 euros or dollars to buy a game. Now you could go to Facebook, play games for free. That's a massive shift, and it worked well for a couple of months or years for Zynga. They got a lot, billions of dollars in revenue. So don't worry about Mark Pincus. He's fine. He's still a billionaire. I see that you're worried. Oh, what happened to Pincus? He still has $1 billion. Don't worry. That's how Silicon Valley works. It was an infrastructural shift, right? They opened up their infrastructure, but it became complicated. And it became complicated because of the third part. It was a massive governance shift, right? Mark Zuckerberg was in charge, and he could say all of a sudden, no more wall posting, enough. So these three are related, and you see massive shifts there. So what I would like to do for the second part of today is to talk through the key concepts and fields of study that really flesh out those three parts. I'm going to talk through that fairly quickly to highlight existing scholarship and what are the key concepts that illustrate this story, and in the book we do that in the chapters as well. So again, focus on the first part of this book. What I want to highlight, and this is, I think, particularly relevant if you're doing a dissertation project or a thesis project, is this work of positioning. The first part of this positioning is that we are very mindful that each of these industries we study have different histories of platform dependency. And that's sort of an argument that goes through the book. Games are always platform dependent. You cannot play a game, a video game, you can play a board game, but a digital game, you have to have a platform. So for 40, 50 years, the game industry has always been platform dependent. That's the term we use. For journalism, it's very different, right? You can still have platform independent production and distribution and marketing monetization for a newspaper. You can buy a physical newspaper on paper. So it's not fully platform dependent. And then the interesting question becomes for us scholars, like how much? Where is it platform dependent and not, and what does that mean? So that could be it's a simple question, but in practice it gets really complicated really fast to flesh out where exactly is that integration, economic, market, etc. The second part of positioning, what we've been doing, is to talk about these bodies of scholarship. I'm a political economist, so I'm mostly interested in questions of power in economics, critical political economy, influenced by Marxist thought. We worked with business studies because business studies, strategic management in particular, it's a completely different field. These first two are typically not into dialogue, critical political economy and business studies. Sometimes there's animosity, to say it lightly. They don't cross the street. Where I work in Toronto, it's literally across the street, and it's also like the fancy rich building is the business school, and we're in media studies, and we're like, hey. But in the book, we need their work. And it's a big question if they need our work. I think so. They might think differently. But we need the work from scholars in economics and management because they have such a good sense of how this industry works. I just have to admit that. Their work is top-notch. It's really empirically rich, conceptually rich. So we draw on that in the book. And then software studies, software platform and app studies, which really focuses on the materiality of the platform. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. So I want to talk to these three parts real quick. Markets, infrastructure, and governments. First, let's talk about my favorite subject, money, economics, and markets. The big shift, and if you want to understand platformization well, we have to see platforms as multi-sided markets. And this is one of those terms coming from business studies. We didn't invent this at all. We are inspired, so to say, or draw on the research from business studies scholars. This has been theorized well by Nobel Prize winners. Two-sided markets, three-sided markets. What does that mean? The platform is in the middle, can be Facebook, and it interfaces between two different sides. On the left, you see end users, which are players then, or users of Facebook. The other side in the market is then a complementer. That's an economic term, a company like Zynga. So what platforms do is they aggregate those connections, and they aggregate transactions. You have to go through a platform. Airbnb, Uber, you name it, they're all platforms because they aggregate Uber passengers and drivers. Like Uber is a very simple two-sided platform. So this is a core economic idea that is fundamental to any platform. Every platform out there works like this. If it doesn't, it's not a platform in an economic sense. Doesn't mean it's an irrelevant company, but in the context of the book and this kind of scholarship, it's just different, and then we don't study it. And it's easy to say because there are not that many companies anymore that don't operate platforms. And if you find this interesting, I can come back to this. Why is this relevant? Multi-sided markets are subject to so-called network effects. Again, there are probably 200-300 papers in economics studying network effects and how they work. They sort of do sort of very quantitative Greek. There's a lot of math I will never understand. And they really do, does this work? What do network effects mean? The more people who join one side of the market, the bigger it becomes. Like growth begets growth. The more people playing a game, the more fun it becomes because you can talk about them at the farm and the pigs and the tractors and the cows, right? The more people playing a game, the more fun it becomes. That's network effects. If they all leave, same thing, right? So the bigger. If they all leave, etc. That's network effects. You can also have indirect network effects. The more people playing a game, the more valuable the platform becomes for the people on the other side of the market, right? The more people playing the game, the more interesting the whole platform becomes for any other party or company that wants to develop games. So indirectly, growth on both sides. Yeah. Because of these network effects, which can be really profound, you can have massive growth really quickly. There are so-called winner-take-all effects. Again, economic term. I always thought this comes from critical political economy economists, right? The winner takes all. To some people, it sounds nicely and it sounds like very positive, but political economists are like, ooh. The question, of course, is then like, who's the winner? Which economists rarely make explicit, and that's, I think, our job. Also in media and communications, like, who are the winners? Companies, people, citizens, etc. But here you see that upwards trajectory. Like Facebook is such a clear winner. And all platform markets trend towards monopolization or a duopoly. Uber and Lyft, Airbnb and something, Facebook and, right? So all markets that are run by platform companies tend to have only 2 or 3 major actors because there's no space for others, typically. Okay, if you find this interesting, we've done a paper where we do this. Again, this is in the folder, so I'm not going to dig into it that much. But this is a paper where we really flesh out how does a specific platform market functions in Canada. So it's a study of the Canadian App Store where we really flesh out that winner-take-all dynamic, doing sort of money financial analysis. And we found that the top 100 of apps generate 85% of all revenue. So there are tens of thousands, if not 100,000 of apps in the Canadian App Store, game apps, but only 100 generate 85%. That's a pretty profound insight we found. And again, very few winners. So yeah, winner take all, but it's only 100 studios in Canada or where there are thousands of studios. Okay, then now we talked about the money. Let's talk about the data, the infrastructure. The big question when it comes to infrastructure is infrastructural integration. What a platform does, it does not only open a market where you can engage in transactions, make money, like Zynga does, like sell tractors, sell coins, sell stuff. But in order to do that, you have to integrate fully your company with the platform. We call that infrastructural integration. So you have the open internet. On top of that, you have Facebook or an app like Messenger, and Zynga integrates with that. We fleshed that out, how that works. It gets really complicated if you really go into the infrastructural layers of a platform. If you find this interesting, I did this with a colleague of mine, Anne Helmont, because we argue that platform companies exist of a series of platform instances. Facebook is not really a company, it's a collection of separate markets. And in this, again, in this paper, we fleshed that out. This is a better way to visualize that. Facebook is not a company, it's a holding company for discrete markets. Like this is the past, but in the new structure you have Messenger, you have Instagram and WhatsApp, and each of them is a separate infrastructural entity and a separate market. So if you're gonna, and so then you're asking, why is this relevant for me? Well, if you're gonna do any kind of scholarship on platforms, you have to be very precise to talk what's my unit of analysis, right? If you say, oh, I study Facebook, okay, great. What exactly about this? Like, do I have a laser pointer? No. Which of those 4 apps are you talking about if you talk about Facebook, if you do research? If you study Instagram, it's very different than WhatsApp. It's very different. So than Messenger or any of the other apps. So infrastructural integration forces us to be very specific about these real deep connections. How can we make sense of that? Another term from economics is the notion of boundary resources. This is a term that talks about this process of infrastructural integration, because how does that work in the real world? Because it sounds so abstract. Well, you integrate with a platform through APIs, application programming interfaces, data connections, right? Computers talking to each other. You integrate through software development kits if you're Zynga. So if you're Zynga and you're a programmer, you integrate with Facebook's data infrastructure through an API. And we call the API the software development kit, the documentation that makes it understandable how to do that, because how do you know how to talk to Facebook's computer? You need instructions. Well, all of that documentation we call boundary resources, which really helps us understand and study platforms for us as scholars, because it makes the platform and the infrastructure legible, literally. It helps us understand the structure of the platform, so we can also study that as scholars, which is, I think, an important process to do. We've done that with, again, Anne Helmont and Fernando van der Vlist, to look at those API structures and those relationships. And this is an example of how those APIs are shifting and how partner networks are shifting. So if you're interested in this question of infrastructural integration, we've done that in this paper, where we sort of take Facebook and we sort of flip it inside out, sort of look at the back end, sort of the infrastructural backdoor. How is Facebook structured at the API level? And because you have all these partners integrating with the platform, what does that look like? Well, we can map that and we can visualize that. So here we have sort of the back end of Facebook, how these partners are structured, and how it also evolves over time. It's constantly, it's very different from day to day. If you find this interesting, we also have a paper recently translated into Spanish, which I'm not going to pronounce it, because then you're going to laugh at me again. But yeah, if you find this interesting, it's also in the folder with the link. Okay, so let me move to that third part. Now we have a sense of platforms and economics, platforms and infrastructures, sort of the key terms a little bit. And then the third part of that conversation is access to the market and access to the infrastructure is governed by rules. We call that governance. Because what platforms want to do is like, yeah, you can go to Facebook as Zynga and integrate yourself. You can do whatever you want, but of course you cannot, right? Initially, you're like, oh yeah, come to our platform, open for business. That's what Mark Zuckerberg said, right? Open for business. Come here with your pigs and your farms, and it's cool. Until it doesn't. So what platforms constantly struggle with, this is their existential sort of corporate conversation every day, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. They always have to oscillate, go back and forth between securing the boundaries and opening up the boundaries. And boundaries are infrastructural and economic boundaries, right? So a platform has to open up a little bit because otherwise you cannot integrate with it and they cannot make money and grow as a business. So there's this constant tension of going back and forth. We did an economic study of that. This is me working with business professors, which was an interesting experience as a humanities media studies scholar. This is a conversation for during drinks, I guess. It was fun, but if you're interested in this question, what we've done in this paper is to really go into depth is if a platform changes its governance framework, its rules, what are the economic implications for complementers, like the financials of it. So in this paper, we've fleshed that out. The moral of the story is if you're not early on the platform, you're in a bad situation, to say it politely, right? So when a new platform launches, you want to be on board quickly because otherwise it gets really rough and tough. And in this paper, we provide a lot of data to back up that claim. Okay, so what I've done now, and then I'm gonna wrap up. I talked through these three fields. I hope you now have a sense of where these questions are coming from, right? Political economy is about who are the winners and who are the losers, although we rarely say losers, but the great theory from business studies, multi-sided markets, boundary resources, it's great conceptual material, but if we take that material, we have to be critical about it if we import it into our field of media studies, because these industries are too important to let to the market, right? If we had Mark Zuckerberg have its way, sorry, it doesn't end well, in my view. And software studies helps us to make explicit all these relationships, because we have to be explicit. What's the market? What does it look like? What is the infrastructural relations? How do they work in practice? And for us scholars, it's so important to be precise in that, because then we can also critique it, and we can find avenues for maybe regulation and better conversations of, okay, what are the implications of all of this? Okay, let me wrap up with some sort of 2 or 3 points from past and future scholarship. One thing we noticed and we want to highlight and sort of put on the agenda constantly is the question of platform evolution. So this is the key takeaway number 1 from what I really care about and find exciting also to discuss. If you're going to study this relationship between platforms and cultural producers, be mindful that platforms are constantly evolving. Their markets are evolving. Their business models are evolving. They're evolving as infrastructures, and every day, every hour, their governance frameworks are evolving. And we've seen that the last couple of days with Twitter, right? If you made your money through Twitter and you had 1.2 or 5 million followers, and you say, Elon Musk, la la la, boom, kicked out of platform, you're, what is it, suspended, which is a nice term for you're strangled and your business is over. That's a pretty profound shift, right? And now it all plays out in 1 or 2 weeks. So that's, you know, for our scholarship, this is sort of great, because we've all been saying, we told you this is going to happen. Listen to us, media scholars. We knew this. We should never have been at this point. But, you know, at least we said it. So this is in the context of platform evolution. If you're studying Twitter today, it's different than Twitter even a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. So we have to be super precise and explicit about if we study an object, whether it's a media company or a platform, that relationship is constantly evolving, which is also sometimes something platforms abuse, right? Where you say, oh, you know, you're doing this one thing that is really bad, or we critique. You know, no, we changed it already. Like, ha, ha, ha. No, you didn't. So platform evolution, something to be mindful of. After the book, we published this paper where we fleshed this out. So if you find this interesting, we did a short paper on the news industry, how platform evolution plays out in this constant battlefield of negotiation. We want to be super mindful in the book and in our scholarship to say platforms are not all powerful, right? They're constant in this tension of opening, securing. Like, they have power, but they're not, you know, they're not, pick your metaphors, kings or queens or emperors. So it's a constant space of negotiations. And why I find this research so exciting, and I hope you do too, is it's fun to map out these constant relationships of tension, because that's where it gets interesting. Like, what do news organizations do? How does Facebook respond, or Meta, or whatever? The second takeaway I want to be sort of mindful of is that what we learned from doing this scholarship is to be mindful of our, what we call silos of scholarship. When we talk to our colleagues in journalism studies, when I talk to my colleagues in game studies, we constantly have to remind ourselves to step outside of our disciplinary boundary. When I did 10, 20 years ago, a lot of game studies research, we never talked to people in journalism studies. And I really hope that our work shows that those conversations can be very productive. And this is pretty hard because in practice, you know, if you want to publish in digital journalism, the journal, and you say, oh, I know something about games, they're like, yeah, but that's not what the journal is about. So in practice, this is hard, but at conferences and in occasions like this, we can have those conversations across modes of production, across fields. And I think that is important because we can learn so much from our different case studies and views. And then the third and last point is be mindful, or what we want to be mindful of that regional aspect. I'm Dutch, based in Canada, so I have a very specific understanding and feelings about US dominance in many respects. I think you get the subtext of what I'm trying to say here. So we want to constantly force ourselves to be explicit of what do we study, where is platform power located. We have to study US-based companies, we have to. We cannot not talk about Meta, we cannot not talk about Twitter, but when we do, let's be mindful of different regional power structures, geopolitical structures and languages, et cetera, et cetera. One paper where we tried to do that, this has come out I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, is where we study Tencent and WeChat and try to see how that process of platformization plays out in the Chinese context, which is very different than the US context. Kind of obvious, but here we go really in depth to flesh that out if you find it interesting. Okay, last slide. In our future work, we're going to talk more, as I said, about platform power. If you find that interesting, we have a special issue, and I invite all of you to read the special or the call for papers and consider applying. This is not necessarily focused on cultural production, but it can be. The deadline is a long ways away, 2 months from now. So if you find this interesting, that's the URL. And it's really about this question, where is platform power located? And again, if you want to read all of this back, or you want to download the papers and more, that's where it is. All caps. So UPF, all caps. Okay, thank you very much.
We have 20 minutes, 30 minutes for questions. Who wants to start? Frederic, you have a lot of questions? Okay, why not?
Thank you for the great presentation, David. Just a quick question. When you talk about this infrastructure and platform, we tend to think about the symbolic aspect of the platform itself, and when you talk about reshaping our creation, distribution, marketization, monetization. But I think that in the last 10 years, there's a structure that is impacting also in all this economy of platforms, which is hardware. Yeah. What are your thoughts about the power of these platforms in terms of, let's say, computing power, hardware, and all the real structure that goes beyond this symbolic idea that we have about the platforms? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. We in chapter 3 about infrastructure, we talk about it a little bit. What I find interesting when writing about infrastructure, we put that all in the rubric or the chapter of infrastructure. So for us, that's an infrastructural question. Might not be for everybody, but it's an infrastructure question for us. First reaction is, I was surprised by how little scholarship there is on this question. Right? So if you're a game studio, if you're a news outfit, if you're a TikToker, creator, any of those industries working with platforms, you, not so much indirectly, you're directly integrating yourself infrastructurally, which means that your content is hosted in the cloud. It can be Microsoft, can be Amazon, can be, of course, Facebook and all these, Google, Alphabet. But I am, again, surprised by how little scholarship there is on that material level. José van Dijksy wrote a paper about this, seeing the forest for the trees, which is, she visualizes this aspect as a tree, where in the foundation where the tree grows, its roots are the cloud. That's the hosting, and then you have the stem of the tree. Again, you can look it up, but this foundation we don't talk enough about. So I hope somebody here is inspired by like, ooh, I am writing about this, or I find this an interesting question, because I think there are 2 or 3 papers out there that really sort of also trace that data, because that doesn't, it's incredibly hard, sure, but much of this can be done. I have yet to see good scholarship on, it exists, but it's rare, where people sort of, okay, where does this data go? Like the literal traces of an app is not just a piece of code and then integrated with Facebook. Most apps, and particularly news and games apps, etc., there are hundreds of software development kits in there. It's like all these data integrations, and how are they related to a cloud, or which cloud? And you can get an app and then sort of pull it open. It's, especially on Google Play and the Android, you can just unpack it, disassemble it, which is in most cases also legal, and then retrace. And I know some scholars in the world are doing this, but there are interesting observations there, because then you can see, again, for us it's all about power. Who owns those clouds? Who owns those data integrations? How are they specifically integrated? And initial research that I've seen comes with such fascinating insights that some of this power is much more diffuse, right? So yes, Amazon is really powerful in the cloud computing hosting business, but then for some companies, the data integrations, there are data intermediaries that are as powerful as Amazon, and we just don't know their names. Or let me speak for myself, I don't know their names, and we don't mention their names that much, but if you're working in the industry, or the game industry, or journalism, everybody knows the name of that data intermediary, but it's not part of our scholarship. So to me, that's a gap, and maybe if somebody here is like, oh, I disagree, it's not a gap because I published about it, let me know, because it's again, a gap. But I think it's a fundamental question, because going forward, you know, talking about power, that's where the power resides, and we have seen the last 2-3 years, if Amazon is like, no, like with Trump and Parler and all that stuff, right, or what may happen with Twitter, or etc., they can just literally switch it off and say, no, go away from our cloud. They have that power. If they would do that to Spanish or Dutch or Canadian companies, you know, these are not theoretical conversations anymore, right? The next US president might say, oh yeah, Spain, you know, something, Amazon cannot do business anymore with Spain, or let's use the Netherlands as an example. No more business, then a large number of Dutch media companies are instantly, like Mark Pincus, poop. And to what extent and how those negotiations play out is largely unknown to us.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
More questions?
Hello, David. Pleasure to have you here. Been a pleasure to hear you. I would like to hear some thoughts about if you could call it platformization, but I had the feeling that you can actually do that, about television production, like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and how you believe my field of analysis is aesthetic analysis. I work on television fiction, but through that way. But I do believe that the arrival of platforms, and of course there has been a change in the production model. I had the feeling that that change in the production model has also affected the aesthetical values and narrative values of new televisual forms. But I would like to hear some thoughts about it if you can produce them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for asking this question, because it allows me something I took out of the slides, and I guess I didn't want to talk about, but now you forced me to, and I should talk about it, which is this distinction between platforms and portals. So if you're really tired, you can zone out for the next 2 minutes. This is very much a theoretical debate, so feel free to completely disagree, because this is not, we have an answer to this in the book, but not everybody agrees with this, and that's of course our job, right? We should disagree. And the answer to the question is, to us, platforms are always multi-sided markets. To us, platforms are infrastructures and markets that aggregate transactions and aggregate institutional connections. So there's an openness of the platform. And in the platform theory, multi-sided market theory, economic theory, it's pretty clear. They would say Netflix is a portal. It's not a multi-sided market. And I agree with that. Netflix is a portal. Doesn't make it an irrelevant company, right? So I see some people like, whoa, 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 where is he going? Doesn't matter that much. It's just a different approach to theorizing it from an economic and infrastructural perspective. What does it mean that Netflix is a portal? Its boundaries are not as open. So it doesn't allow any of us here probably to go to Netflix right now and say, ooh, I shot a really cool cat video, put it on Netflix. No, it's like, haha, it is a really cute cat video. But no, it's not going to happen, because Netflix is closed off as a portal. And then you're like, ooh, why is this relevant? Well, it has a very fundamental different economic logic because of it. Again, not less important, but it's very different. So it elicits different questions economically and infrastructurally, et cetera. It's a different kind of company. And we do spend some time in the first version of chapter 2 of the book, Markets. I had 3,000 words. And then the reviewers and the people were like, this is boring as hell. Take it out, take it out. So we shortened it. But we still stand by it. And again, this is very much a debate. So this may change. And that's also an interesting question. Can Netflix become a multi-sided market? Yes. And it's sort of flirting with it, because that's where the growth and the money is. And that's where it becomes interesting again. Netflix is now opening up as an advertising platform. So it sort of adds a side in the market, right? It becomes an advertising player, or sort of an actor in the advertising ecosystem. So then those logics of growth, of infrastructure integration, blah, 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 they come into play again. They are also looking at the game industry. And maybe they're much more open to the game industry because it has a very different publishing logic than the film television industry, right? Film and television, as you probably know, is very entrenched. The production houses, they interface with Netflix, not just small studios. Now it's opening up with games, so Netflix might change. And really good, interesting scholarship is emerging what that means for those power relationships. And you didn't ask this question, but why is this also relevant, this portal platform distinction, is that we might see actors that are outside of the realm of media and communication come into the media industries and opening themselves up. For example, Uber, right? Uber is now just a transportation company, or whatever you want to call it, classify it, depends on if you're a mayor or a politician, but let's call it transportation company platform. Get a person from A to B, but they're also flirting with advertising. Integrate advertising into the app, but maybe even more, right? You're on a ride, and if you watch advertising during your Uber ride, they might subsidize that ride or give you a discount. But they also might start thinking about media integrations. and become a player in the media ecosystem. I don't know exactly how that would look like. They don't pay me enough to think about this, right? But you can envision that, oh, you're on an Uber ride, you watch something, or there's something happening there. So then Uber becomes a player in the media industry, but not as a platform, but as a side in a market, etc. So these are conversations. I said, not that I'm that smart about it, but people like me have said that, oh, Uber is going to be a player, or an Airbnb. All these platform companies are going to move toward the media and advertising industries because that's where the growth and the money is. And now they're doing it, right? Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, all these big companies, Amazon, of course, are moving sort of to us, media and communications, because there's enormous symbolic value, there's economic value, there's growth potential, etc. So hopefully this kind of theory helps us to understand those power relationships, because not all platforms then stay platforms. They get a different role and have different positions of power.
Thank you. There was another question there. This discussion about how broad is the concept of platform makes me remember the same for the concept of media. And for Marshall McLuhan, media was everything. Any technology was a media. For other people, media is a broadcasting media. So that's important for you in the theoretical framework of the thesis. You had to define very well the concepts. So if you're working with platform, you have to define it very well if you are talking about any kind of platform, or Netflix is not a platform. Sounds wow. But you have to just explain that. Maybe the 300 words, no pages, words is enough to describe that in your theoretical framework, okay? Yeah. So here,
no, sorry. Yeah. Hi, I love the presentation, so thank you. I didn't know that your background was for games, and I'm very pleased because mine is too. And for the previous conversation about Netflix, I wanted to, this phrase that I love, that I just heard it, what are your thoughts of Steam and indie publishing? Because in video games, there are these two sides, like AAA games and indie games. My background is from indie games, and from our experience, you cannot start even thinking about publishing your game if you don't go to a publisher. Annapurna, Raw Fury, Devolver Digital, Fellow Traveler, there are many of them. Most of them are in Europe and in United States. And what were you talking about, what Netflix becoming a portal, not a platform? I was thinking the same about the Steam, because of course you can pay 100 euros and you upload a game on Steam, but every day they're being publishing 100 different games, like every day. It's very, very difficult to get on the top of the page, to the main page of Steam. So if you don't have a publisher, that is this company that just market your game. And I find it very interesting because from our experience working, this kind of company prioritizes the indie development, that is, you are just 1, 2, 3 people. That is the people that is going to the screen. You are very precarious. You have worked off a lot, like no sleep and no eating and no seeing your children, because this is the true indie experience. And if you know that type of tale that we want to tell about this type of games, you are going to sell. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for raising this issue, because why I started this conversation, like I said in the beginning, with my colleague Thomas Poole, is because I still think that the game industry, for better or worse, is always slightly ahead of the curve in terms of economic innovations, in terms of labor. I don't know if we should call them innovations, but shifts in labor and precarity in labor. And the game industry is such a good example also of the power of platforms, because Steam, you may know the platform of Steam where you can download PC games, has been around for a pretty long time. And we can see it went through all those sort of platform evolution, right? It went through all kinds of iterations. It was really small, but it holds tremendous power. And I think what's important for us is, first of all, not to normalize it. Like, oh yes, Steam is powerful. Okay, and then walk away. I think we, especially in media and communication, should always sort of denaturalize, denormalize monopolies. Never accept it. In any paper you write about this, not okay. That's what I hope we should, that's my suggestion. If I'm a peer reviewer of your paper, not okay. We shouldn't accept this as the status quo. And the reason is because these are mostly US-based platform companies. And in the game industry, you see so well how this plays out if you have zero regulation. Right? Steam highlights a couple of games and it creates winners, it picks winners and losers. And there are hundreds and thousands of smaller outfits, indie game studios and teams, small teams that are left out. We can have a debate. One of my colleagues from QUT in Australia, Brendan Keogh, is about to publish a book about this, sort of the game industry doesn't exist. I think that's the title, which is, it's a great book that talks about this issue. Maybe it could be that game development becomes sort of a hobbyist practice, right? Because you're a musician, if you have a couple of friends and you make some music and you don't make money, then nobody is worried about you. Oh, you're just making music, it's just a hobby, right? That's great. Maybe some parts of media culture are moving towards that space, but for some industries, that promise is there. So if that's the case, I hope you're still with me. Do you get where I'm going? So for some parts of the media industries, maybe we should start accepting that it goes to a hobbyist, non-professional, amateur phase. And that's fine, right? We can accept that collectively. Okay, if you make some kind of game, it's fine. You're just an indie studio. However, the big problem is, and it's the same for creators, and it's the same for game development, then everybody in this ecosystem should know that. Right? One of my colleagues, Brooke Duffy, wrote about aspirational labor. Most of the people being creators, most of the people in the game industry are in the game industry. They're in indie studios. They're not like, this is not a hobby, I need to eat. Right? So there's a disconnect. If you're a musician, you're familiar with this. If you're a musician for decades, you're like, I'm just a musician. I do this in the weekend, and that's fine. I don't want to need or want to make money, and maybe I get $10 from Spotify or 10 euros from Spotify a month or a year, but I'm not banking on it. But for other parts of the industry, maybe we should have that debate then. To say, okay, it seems that in the current system, either we punch through the power of these platforms like Steam, YouTube, app stores, where we force them to provide a broader array of voices, and we force them to say, you have to highlight more Spanish language content. You have to highlight more Dutch content. If you operate in the Netherlands, you have to, by force, because otherwise they don't do it. So maybe that's a solution, but if we don't do that, then we also have to accept that if you go into the game industry right now, you're not going to make a lot of money. You're going to be unemployed. Don't blame me or scholars, but that's the reality. So we have to have that debate and soon, and not reify from, oh, if you go into the game industry, yeah, you can be a billionaire. Yeah, okay. You can also buy a lottery ticket and be a billionaire, but the chance is just really slim. So we have to be explicit about that. So thanks for that question.
More questions? Oh, here we have more. Alex, and then.
Hello, really great talk, thank you. My field, hey, I'm Alex, I'm a master's student, and my field of research is artificial intelligence. And I want to know your thoughts on the whole mechanisms that emerge, like resistance to that platform dependence, like for example the open source, because since the beginning of that revolution of the artificial intelligence and the generation of image, it has been a real tension between the classical company like OpenAI and the open source stable diffusion thing, and I want to know your thoughts on that, and if it really changed anything, or at the end it remains the same for that platformization. Thank you.
So in one of the early slides and early in the book, we talk about that promise of democratization in a really influential book, Wealth of Networks, by a US Israeli scholar, Yochai Benkler. So you may have heard of this book, Wealth of Networks. Brilliant book, very well written. It was in that same moment, 2005, 6, 7, 8, where there was a lot of promise about, hey, we can have what he calls commons-based, non-proprietary, non-market-based modes of cultural production. It could be like open source. And at the time, you know, there was great promise because this was just during or slightly before Facebook. Remember that graph when Mark Pincus was interested? At that point, there was that promise and it could have been. But now, you know, 10, 15 years later, we know the answer. It didn't happen, right? So open source is completely appropriated by platform companies. So we have an answer to that question. In theory, the theory still holds, right? You can have those modes of production and it can, in theory, work really well. But it hasn't materialized. Particularly in the media industry, we all know there are very few open source tools. Like even in the game industry, like my main expertise is, you used to have many more open source tools, but now it's all Unity. If you're familiar with games, you may have heard it's a tool to make games, an engine, which is a for-profit company, very proprietary. So that avenue is closed off. And I think governments and universities have not helped us in that sense either. So if I look at the University of Amsterdam, University of Toronto, my institutions, they also constantly go towards platform companies for any of their services, which I find very painful. Email, Microsoft, or Google. Any kind of tools, we're going to also train you to use Unity. So they're, you know, reflecting on ourselves for the last decade, many scholars have not used or invested in those tools, which is disappointing. So that hasn't happened. It might happen. Right? I'm always hoping that there would be, and this is not my idea, José van Dijk, my mentor, she's very keen on this idea that wouldn't it be great if the European Union invested in a commons-based, open, non-political streaming platform? And some people are like, oh no, not another European Union thing, or I would, you know, I love public broadcasting. Dutch public broadcasting is fantastic. If you're in North America, you appreciate it even more. It's very non-partisan, it's very non-political, at least in the Netherlands. Wouldn't it be great if we had an alternative, publicly funded, but not politically overseen infrastructures, right? That was one of the first questions, where we had infrastructures that help us put stuff in the cloud that is not owned and operated by a US or Chinese company. It sounds like such a simple thing, and in practice it's really hard because we all know why it's hard, but yeah, it can be done, and I hope the next 2-3 years it will be done. And you know, that's maybe the good thing about coming all of the last 2 weeks with Twitter, that people are like, oh, okay, yeah, we don't want that, right? So that's my hope, that okay, this is the final example of, you know, should I say it? A person with a certain inclination comes by, it's a polite way of saying, who does things that is not in the collective interest of us Europeans. I hope we agree on that, or we can agree on that. So, and now we have no alternatives. Okay, now, come on, let's do it. It's not that expensive anyway, in the grand scheme of things. Let's build a more public system. So.
Hi, David. Thanks for sharing your research and for being here today. My name is Admon. I am a PhD candidate here at Pompeu Fabra, and even though what I'm doing right now, my thesis research has nothing to do with what you have in fact said today, my background is about political theory, and I would like to know your thoughts about one key concept that has been, you know, moving over the presentation all the time, but that you have probably on purpose exactly defined, which is power. And there was in this regard, a very interesting slide in which you sort of contrasted, let's say, well, platforms generate the possibility, you know, of, let's say, everyone to share their thoughts or create content, but on the other hand, they generate a huge concentration in a few amount of corporations. So I would like to know your thoughts about you know, taking into account this process of platformization and concentration of power. Which notion of power would you say is now taking the lead? Let's say something that we can redistribute and thus empower communities or users, or let's say the classical notion of power as domination.
Yeah, great. This is again one of those questions like I took material out, as you keenly observed, and I was secretly hoping that somebody would ask this question, because then I feel really smart, or well, hopefully. Yeah, what's your theory of power? And we've had long debates to how. So the short answer would be the way we see power here. First of all, we define it as institutional power, institutional platform power, because we're focused, especially today and in the first half on the book, on institutions. And we involve end users in this conversation, but to an extent. So we focus on institutional power, and that power for us is always relational. That's sort of, we have a relational view on power because it breaks down into these two components, economic power and infrastructural power. So we see that power as deeply contingent. That's a term we use a lot in the book and in our writing. Contingent on platforms, so in a double meaning. If you're interfacing with a platform, your power is contingent on the whims of the platform, but to an extent it's relational, because platforms always are in this space of tension, of negotiation, where they open up and they can close down. So it's a constant relational effort, because if they're too closed down and they're too harsh, the growth goes down, the complementars go away. So it's a constant act of negotiation, and that process makes all of these questions, whether we're talking about labor, which I haven't talked about today on purpose, but labor, democracy, creativity, but also economics and markets, all these big questions are deeply contingent. They're constantly shifting and changing. So that's the beginning of an answer. But in this, in the book, the next book, Platform Power, and in this special issue, we're going to sort of do much more of that work, because you're asking the €1,000,000 question, one of the most important questions. So this is the beginning of an answer, but we're definitely feel the pressure to theorize this better and more, because there's more to say about this. But this is the short version, and I hope you agree.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more answer, because, sorry, one more question, and one answer, obviously, because outside we have the coffee break. So who wants to ask the last question? TikTok. About TikTok.
Yes, please do a TikTok question.
Okay, we have talked a lot about Facebook. This is the last question. Do you think TikTok will be the first and last Chinese platform to arrive in Western markets?
No, that would really surprise me. Yeah, TikTok. I love TikTok so much, too much. And I come from the world of video games, so I'm familiar with addiction questions and playing too much. So I replaced my playing of video games an hour a day with watching TikTok an hour a day. Which is also great if you're going to a new city. Their IP tracking is so fantastic. Arrived there over the weekend, and then you're here, and then on the beach, and you see, oh, this is where you should go to eat. And these are beautiful Barcelona dogs and cats. So I love everything about it, about the TikToks. No, I don't think it will be. So much innovations are happening in China that it's hard for me to grasp or to see a future where all of that innovation is not coming here. There's a massive push now with President Xi, who's going to be around for a while, to export all that. And the Americans, as they always do, have different views, talking about power, about soft power and hard power and chips and all of that. And we're sort of in the middle. And I think, again, it's time for us, Europeans, to define our own values and how we relate to those companies, and not be so sort of deferential to the US in defining that, because they do it on their terms, and they do it also on really duplicitous grounds, where you see Mark Zuckerberg coming in and say, oh, TikTok is a threat because they're Chinese. And there is a sort of a racist undercurrent there. If you see his lobbyists go to senators and say, we should hold TikTok back because something, evil, which I'm like, dude, really? You have the nerves to use that argument? And like, their government is spying on you. It's like, what? Have you not read the Snowden? What? So, you know, again, I think we as Europeans should decide who do we want to share our data with. The Americans are already, you know, they have everything, what we're doing. That's no secret anymore. If China has all of that data, don't they, you know, what do we have an opinion on that? I don't think at this point anybody should be surprised that TikTok and ByteDance is siphoning off that data, that TikTok used data. They're pretty, you know, the cat is out of the bag if you haven't seen it. And of course they want to do that. Not of course, I'm not agreeing with it, but that's sort of a logical endpoint. So I think it's gonna, all those innovations are coming sort of our way. And then we just have, especially right now, this is the moment, right? The next 1, 2, 3 years, it's up to you and us to what do we think of this? Should we get exciting transportation, innovations in e-commerce, in education? Should we import those technologies and thoughts and ideas from China? We can, or not, right? It's up to us to define that and have an answer to that, especially as media and communication scholars, rather than sort of staring west and like, ooh, what is some senator from Missouri thinking of this? Because we don't want those dudes to define what we do here. So let's keep it to ourselves as Europeans and set the terms of that debate, what we think of China and what we want to get out of Innovate, and without the racist undertones of US senators. So that's not a complete answer to your question, but it's...
We need a European Billy.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much. Okay.